Hello, this is your host, Renata Ortega. Welcome to today's episode of the Cycle Breaker and Changemaker podcast. This podcast is all about how to break free from negative generational cycles in order to create meaningful, lasting changes. For helpful tools and answers to your most pressing questions, be sure to follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Cycle Breaker Changemaker. I look forward to helping you on your cycle breaking and change making journey. I promise you will find nothing more rewarding than this. Hello, and welcome back to the Cycle Breaker and Changemaker podcast. If you've been following along, you know that I like to take a deep dive into how trauma shapes our behaviors and responses to the world around us. Today, I'm introducing something that will lay the foundation for our next few episodes, the 5 F's of trauma response. This is a concept that explains how our brains and bodies react when we feel threatened, even if the threat is no longer present. Trauma lives in the body, and because of that, our responses are not always logical. Sometimes, we find ourselves reacting in ways that don't seem to make sense. We may feel like we're constantly fighting, running away, shutting down, appeasing others, or feel completely helpless. And that's because these are all deeply ingrained survival instincts. In today's episode, I'm going to introduce each of the 5 F's, give you an example of how they might show up in daily life, and explain why recognizing these responses is so crucial for healing. In future episodes, I will explore each of these in more depth. So, what are the 5 F's of trauma response? The 5 F's are fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and flop. These are the ways that our nervous system responds to danger. These are instinctive reactions, shaped by past experiences, and often occur before we even have time to think. So let's start with the first F, fight. The fight response is the instinct to confront a threat head on. This might look like anger, defensiveness, or an intense need to be in control. People who default to the fight response may often find themselves arguing, feeling like they have to prove themselves, or reacting aggressively in situations where they feel challenged. It's a way of trying to regain a sense of power. Flight. If fight isn't an option, flight might be. This response makes you want to escape, either physically by leaving a situation or mentally by staying busy and distracted. People with the dominant flight response may avoid confrontation, overwork themselves, or feel like they can never sit still. They're always on the move, always looking for an exit. Freeze. Sometimes, the brain decides that neither fighting nor fleeing is an option, so it shuts down instead. The freeze response can feel like mental fog, disassociation, or being unable to act when faced with stress. If you've ever found yourself stuck in a situation where you knew you needed to do something but couldn't move, that's freeze in action. Fawn. The fawn response is about appeasement, seeking safety by pleasing others. People who have learned to fawn often prioritize other people's needs at the expense of their own. They may struggle with saying no, setting boundaries, or speaking up for themselves because they've learned that keeping the peace is the safest option. And finally, flop. The lesser-known flop response is when the body completely shuts down. This is the experience of feeling powerless, exhausted, and unable to take action. People who experience this may find themselves giving up easily, feeling helpless, or struggling with extreme fatigue when faced with stress. So, why do these responses matter, and why do we need to understand them? Each of these responses is a survival mechanism. At some point, they help to keep you safe. But if they continue to shape your behavior in ways that don't serve you anymore, they can become exhausting and overwhelming. For example, if your trauma response is fight, you may find yourself constantly on edge, reacting with anger, even when it's not necessary. If your response is flight, you might struggle with feeling like you're always running from your problems. If you freeze, you might feel stuck, unable to move forward. If you fawn, you might struggle with maintaining your own identity and needs. And if you flop, you may feel like you don't have the energy to change your situation at all. So, here's my question for you. Do any of these responses resonate with you? Do you see yourself perhaps in one or more of these patterns? Understanding your primary trauma response is the first step towards healing. And over the next few episodes, I'm going to help you do just that. We're going to explore each of these responses in depth, talk about how they shape our relationships and behaviors, and discuss practical steps to regain control. Before I wrap up today's episode, I want to share a little bit about my personal experience with these trauma responses. For most of my life, I thought I was just someone who worked hard, avoided conflict, and someone who began to feel exhausted all the time. What I didn't realize was that I was switching between flight, fawn, and flop responses without even knowing it. I was always keeping myself busy, running from my own thoughts. I had so much trouble saying no, even when it meant sacrificing my own well-being. And when things got too overwhelming, I would completely shut down. Recognizing these patterns in myself was the first step toward changing them. And that's why I'm so passionate about sharing this with you. Because once you understand what's happening, you can start making choices that align with your healing, rather than your past trauma. So that's it for today's episode. I hope this introduction to the 5 F's of trauma response has given you something to think about. Over the next few episodes, we'll be diving deeper into each response, breaking them down, and giving you tools to start working through them. If this episode resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you. Let me know which of these responses you recognize in yourself. And if you think this episode could help someone else, please share it with them. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, healing is a journey, and you are not alone. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Cycle Breaker and Changemaker. I would love to hear from you and to receive your feedback. Remember, you can reach me on Instagram or Facebook at Cycle Breaker Changemaker. Please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts in order to help me continue to help you. I am looking forward to having you join me for the next episode. Until then, please take care.